Thank you for coming. So nice to see you. Well, today I'm going to talk, and that we have been kind of working our way through the suffering, impermanence, and no self. And I decided that I would take kind of a little backward step into impermanence, but it also involves no self and suffering. So anyway, today I'm going to talk about grief and impermanence. But before we do that, I wanted to say a couple of words about Sangha. If you aren't familiar, the three jewels of Buddhism are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And Ananda once said to the Buddha, the Sangha is part of our practice, an important part of our practice. And the Buddha's reply was, do not say that, Ananda, do not say that. The Sangha is the whole of our practice. So you can see how important we all are to each other. And so would Sudha Zen, our Sangha, is intended to be a Sangha where we can take refuge and where we can participate and grow. And it's a place of safety and comfort with the acknowledgement of our inner being. And as a Sangha, we have the opportunity to express compassion to each other. And I urge each of you to get to know each other if you don't already. And to encourage that, I'm putting together a Sangha directory for those of you that want to be included. And also want you to know that Kirk and I are always happy to hear your suggestions and feedback. We welcome that. And we're also available for practice discussion. If you are interested in that, we can do that via email, via phone, Zoom, whatever, text. That might be weird, but whatever works for you. So I mentioned last week that we're going backwards, but I got more involved with my thoughts on grief and impermanence. And I remember that the Buddha taught that all phenomena, including thoughts and sensations and experience, are marked by the three marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, and no self. And that is sort of the grand slam of Buddhist thought right there. So in actuality, we're moving forward in our studies and using grief as the catalyst. I just decided to speak about this topic because of the horrific Hamas attacks on Israeli citizens and the Israeli military bombings and invasion of Gaza. And the grief felt by those survivors is incalculable. And as we consider our appropriate response to that, we hold those personally impacted by acknowledging their trauma with love and compassion. I'd like to start off by reading a poem to honor the dead and dying. It's a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh. This body is not me. I am not limited by this body. I am life without boundaries. I have never been born and I have never died. Look at the ocean and the sky filled with stars, manifestations from my wondrous true mind. Since before my time I have been free. Birth and death are only doors through which we pass. Sacred thresholds on our journey. Birth and death are a game of hide and seek. So laugh with me. Hold my hand. Let us say goodbye. Say goodbye to meet again soon. We meet today and we will meet again tomorrow. We will meet at the source every moment. we will meet each other in all forms of life. This is Thich Nhat Hanh's contemplation of no coming and no going. So grief is universal and specific, and as humans, of course, we find it inescapable. And as people who, many of us are familiar with the heartbreak of addiction and loss, we've already opened our hearts to others. Sadly, in the last month or two, a couple of Sangha members have lost their daughters to this disease of addiction. Our dear friend, Reverend Steve Given, who spoke at our Sangha recently, he lost his beautiful daughter last week. And I would like to dedicate the merit of this talk today, to her. Her name is Loa Sage Rosales. Please hold her and Steve and his wife Terry in your hearts today. And as an expression of sympathy, or maybe the appropriate response, we sent flowers from our Wholesale Wood Sangha to them. And the loss is spectacularly varied, and when we look deeply, it's easy to understand the concept of impermanence. You know, this happens to me more and more often. We can lose our keys, lose our hair, lose our memories, and in the end, we lose our life. And we have losses like money and other material items that can bring up feelings. But we bounce back pretty quickly when we consider there are much greater losses that we will experience. Losing a game of pickleball, for instance, compared to the loss of a loved one, illustrates how we can, we continue to experience loss on many levels. We suffer often with the loss of trust, and the loss of love, and the loss of friendship. And we can grieve the loss of our spiritual beliefs. For the more intimate losses, we have the opportunity through Buddhist practice to sit zazen and experience the intensity of those losses, moment to moment, breath by breath, with the knowledge that our suffering will change and possibly become a gift that can produce in us compassion and wisdom. We learn to bear the unbearable by creating a wide field in our mind where we can hold both our grief and our joy with practice. It has been my habit my whole life to try to make sense of the world by turning to books for information, ever the librarian, right? On how to deal with difficult situations. And it's really, for me, a grief delaying tactic. I spend trying to make sense of unbearable feelings, to deal with the chaos of growing up in an alcoholic family. I would seek refuge in the town library or bookmobile. When I was 33, my best friend took her own life, and I checked out every possible book on suicide to try to make sense of her choice and what really felt like a direct hit on my heart. I began to experience, as I got older, a series of losses: my parents, a boyfriend, and then a long stream of grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends. The use of books as a distraction began to be replaced by the use of drugs and alcohol. And when my daughter, Lisette, died, I was finally brought to my knees by grief, and no book or essay or poem could provide distraction. And by this time, I'd been sober long enough and had my wits about me enough to know that taking a drink or a drug would only make the heartbreak worse. So, cracked open by despair, I felt I would drown in my own grief. And this is not unusual, and my grief is not unique. I am in an endless long line of parents who have had to watch their children die before them. It is a monumental loss based on deep love and connection. And for my son, it's the heartbreaking loss of his sister and his best friend. I'm very, very lucky to have my beloved son, Sam, to share happy memories of my daughter with, because as many of you know, she was quite fabulous. There is a well-known Buddhist story and of Kisagatami and the mustard seed that helps us understand impermanence and grief. Kisagatami was a young woman from a wealthy family who was happily married to an important merchant. When her only son was 1 year old, he fell ill and died suddenly. Kisagatami was struck with grief. She could not bear the death of her only child. Weeping and groaning, she took the dead baby in her arms and went from house to house, begging all the people in the town for news of ways to bring her son back to life. Of course, nobody could help her, but Kisagatami would not give up. Finally, she came across a Buddhist who advised her to go see the Buddha himself. When she carried the dead child to the Buddha and told him her sad story, he listened with patience and compassion and then said to her, Kisagatami, there is only one way to solve your problem. Go and find me 4 or 5 mustard seeds from any family in which there has never been a death. Kisagatami was filled with hope and set straight away to find such a household. But very soon she discovered that every family she visited had experienced the death of one person or another. At last, she understood what Buddha had wanted her to find out for herself, that suffering is part of life and death comes to us all. Once Kisagatami accepted the fact that death is inevitable, she could stop her grieving. She took the child's body away and later returned to the Buddha and became one of his followers. In these old Buddhist stories, it's always great because, they have enlightenment on a certain subject and everything falls into place right away. But you may not feel that instantaneous relief with this realization. In my opinion, grief takes time and it's unpredictable. And who knows how long it took Kisagatami. I have deep respect for the works of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but have found through experience that there are more than 5 stages of grief. And we experience many of them. There are days when grief will wash over me in waves and days where it will feel like a slug in the stomach. For a while, after my daughter died, I remained in magical thinking that involved bargaining and communicating with her through a medium. She would have had a really big laugh over that one. But I was desperate. And the refrain in my mind, I want my daughter back, I want my daughter back, kept playing over and over in my head. And I experienced the desert of depression and the hopelessness of being left behind. The Zen nun Rengetsu wrote, "The impermanence of this floating world I feel over and over. It is hardest to be the one left behind." I tried to hold on to anything solid, trying to get my bearings in what Dogen calls the grounds of groundlessness. I got through what I called deep end grief, one breath at a time, clutching the kitchen counter. I went through the basics of grief, as we all do: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But I also experienced guilt and relief and resentment and self-pity and loneliness and physical pain and even suicidal thinking. As I reflected on the idea that there is no self without other, I had to progress through each stage, albeit a little clumsily. But I knew in my core that I would survive, at least temporarily. And silly as it sounds, I kept thinking of those lyrics to an old song, always something there to remind me, over and over again, you know. When there is always something there to remind me, I was born to love her, and I will never be free. She will always be a part of me. Like many people, I'm pushed into the hard question of why. You all have experienced loss, and maybe you have come up with an answer for why, and maybe the loss came as no surprise. But all of us have experienced some form of grief. I feel deep gratitude from my friends, many of you here, and my family who were able to support my son, Sam, and myself during this difficult time. I find for myself, without the connection of Sangha and recovery, I can get stuck in my own sorrow and pity. And I'm here talking about this because of you. Over time with Buddhist practice, my ideas about a solid self have dissolved through the beautiful gift of my grief. My practice allows me to transform the wide, deep love that I had for Lisette into a more universal love for all beings. It has allowed me to become a more inclusive person and to really try to understand the suffering of others. Yet I don't want to gloss it over. It's a terrible, lonely path. Well-meaning people who may not know how to appropriately respond fall back on time heals all wounds. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and even get over it. And this can be infuriating and hurtful for someone who is suffering from profound loss. I think we need to find ways to appropriately respond to the suffering of others. Many of us have suffered or are suffering from anticipatory grief, where we know ahead of time that we will lose something or someone very dear to us. If you've been a hospice worker, which I know some of you have, or a caregiver, which some of you have, or a relative or a friend of a dying person, you understand deeply what this means. The media has kept us informed of the terror and death that is happening in Israel. On October 7th, the attack in which more than 1,400 Israelis lost their lives plunged in Israel into shock and grief. With terrified citizens in the south barricading themselves in their homes, the military took hours to respond. Feelings of vulnerability and abandonment were only deepened as desperate families of missing and captive Israelis found no government official to talk to for days. The situation is unthinkable for most of us. Some of us have relatives there. It touches us, some of us more deeply than others. But when we consider that suffering is universal and that we all exist in relationship to each other, it can create a deep heart opening that opens to compassion and right action. We have the opportunity to ask ourselves again, what is the appropriate response? How can we, with our own losses, keep our hearts open to the suffering of all people? The suffering's going on right now, in this moment. On a global level, we're continually asking ourselves, what can we do? How can we bear witness to the suffering of people in Ukraine, Nigeria, Syria, Myanmar, How can we not? We are all interconnected, the good and evil. And as Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, I am the frog swimming happily in the clear pond, and I am also the grass snake who, approaching in silence, feeds itself on the frog. I am the child in Uganda, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks, and I am the arms merchant selling deadly weapons to Uganda. I am the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am the pirate, my heart net, yet capable of seeing and loving. Like the diversity of people in the world, the landscape of grief is varied and can only be discovered through our own intimate experience. Joan Halifax wrote, "The river of grief might pulse deep inside us, hidden from our view, but its presence informs our lives at every turn. It can drive us into numbing habits of escape from suffering and bring us face to face with our own humanity." This is the very heart of Buddhism. Grief helps us understand permanence at its deepest possible level and to merge with it fully. And as Buddha says, everything vanishes. We come to understand that impermanence isn't later, it's right now, right here. Witnessing everything vanish, it can be scary, and we can dodge the idea through rationalization. The idea that we can be living and dying, coming and going in each moment can be unsettling, but we're doing both right now. There's no separation. Through wisdom and compassion, the realization that despair and equanimity can coexist is the path to practice. There is great fear in the unknown and in dying. We live in a culture that seeks to extend youth, and until we stop vainly holding on to our disappearing abilities and accept the natural changes of this human form, we may get stuck in fear. This loss of self-definition can be an excruciating process for some. When we lose a job or livelihood, we can cling to the old forms as maybe a teacher or a doctor or a construction worker or even a librarian. Realizing these are all empty concepts can really be freeing. Change is happening, and we have the opportunity to let all those definitions dissolve and begin to sit with ourselves as we really are, imbued with Buddha nature, and to fully appreciate and be awake to our own precious lives. As I said before, with acceptance, grief can be a beautiful gift. And as we say in the promises in recovery, we will not regret the past or wish to shut the door on it. Even though we've lost that old moment, there's a new one arriving. I carry the memories of the people and animals that I've lost along with me as I move forward. This pain that comes with impermanence is a profoundly beautiful reminder of what it is to be alive, as the depth of the pain is equal to the love you feel. We are all capable of great love. We can apply that, we are able to apply universally. Nothing can bring back what's been lost. But there is contentment to be found through living our lives free of the bondage of self and to perform compassionate acts to help ease the suffering of others. I've seen some people approach their impending death with a sense of grief, with awe and curiosity. And as many of you know, the great matter for Buddhist study is birth and death. And so many Zen priests follow a form for writing death poems, sometimes throughout their lives. And I'd like to share with you the death poem written by our friend Renshen's great teacher, Steve Stuckey. He was and is a great human. His poem is, This human body truly is the cosmos. Each breath of mine is equally one of yours, my darling. This tender abiding in my life is the fierce glowing fire of inner earth, linked with all pre-phenomena, flashing to the distant horizon, from right here now to just this. Now the horizon itself drops away. Bodhisvaha. Thank you for listening. We will have a few moments of Zazen, and maybe Kirk, you can